Hello, class. It's me, Miss Roberts, and today we're going to go over Introduction to Debate. Within this module, not only will we be talking about the debating process, but we'll also be talking about the affirmative and negative side, for and against the position. All three of my cats are sleeping behind me, so Katrina's there, in the black, Ash is there in the middle, and Jasmine is there in the white somewhere in the background. The sunlight's kind of obscuring her. So my cats always make that guest appearance, and this video won't be any different. Let's begin. All right. Oh, pardon me. So let me go ahead and go to our first slide, Introduction to Debate. I'm gonna have to move this around as I change slides, just depending on what information is behind my screen here. But let's go over what is debate and some of the similarities between the debate process and what we've been doing in the previous projects. So, because it's the final assignment or one of the final major projects, um, depending on the context of this video. So, for example, I teach this class via hybrid, so we'll have an in-person debate. But if you are watching this video as my online asynchronous class, then we'll have our two videos where we go back and forth. So those are just some of the modifications depending on the modality. If you're in my in-person class, you're just watching this for an additional um, for an additional for additional resource, then of course it'll be online excuse me, it'll be in person as well. So when we think about debate, it's a process that determines how change should occur to justify altering the way that we think and live. So some real life examples would be Congress and they're discussing bills and changing the way that America works, discussions, and our interpersonal relationships. So think about when you're trying to convince your mom or dad or your brother sisters to borrow the car, or we're trying to debate on certain courses of action, or think about debates we have in romantic relationships. Debate and argumentation is everywhere. So let's go ahead and talk about debate in a more academic sense. So when we think about debating, it's one of my favorite courses for this reason. Sometimes debating is fun, especially when we're trying to make sense of the world. This is a critical thinking class. So when we think about debating, don't think of necessarily arguing and fighting, but saying your point of view, backing up your arguments or backing up your claims and listening to other person's claims. Are you changing your mind or are they changing their mind? Many of us do this for sport and you can create our own arguments. We're developing our communication skills. So whether this is communication studies course or a speech course, that's one of the main reasons that we have this class is because we are strengthening our communication skills and our in an argumentation context. Can be an instrument for change. So when we think about changing how the world works and making the change that we want to see, it starts with the argument. It starts with the claim that says, "Hey, this is what we need to be changed. We are advocating for rights, we're advocating for equality, we're advocating for changing the status quo to make life better." It all begins with a single argument and then is a catalyst for change. And it is accessible to many, especially when we think about the access to social media, especially platforms like TikTok and Instagram and YouTube specifically. We're able to see the common man or common woman's voice and think about different opinions. We're able to form those opinions based on the opinions that we see on social media. So it's not just talking heads on the round table or just politicians saying their opinions about how the world works and more. We can all potentially have a platform to share how we feel and have people respond to us and engage in discourse. All right. So next we have the policy debate format. So when we think about the format, we have two sides, the affirmative, which is in favor of the resolution, which is the topic, or negative, which is opposite of the resolution. So in my courses, I choose your topic. I randomly put you in groups or one-on-one or in pairs, depending on the size of our classes, and we duke it out. So we duke it out verbally, where depending on which side you're on, if you're in the affirmative, you have to be in support of the topic of the resolution. Or if you're on the negative side, you have to be on the side of, excuse me, against the resolution. So in this case, you don't get to choose. That's why I like to have the policy speech and other assignments, so where we can choose which topics to formulate. But now it's showtime. So we also have the constructive. So it's the outline of the main arguments. And this is how we plan and plot out how we engage with the opposing team. In previous modules and previous lectures, I talk about public speaking briefly as a review for those of us who've taken a public speaking course, or as a brief introduction. So because verbal argumentation is the main way that we express ourselves in this class, we have to figure out, okay, how do we outline? How do we deliver? How do we express ourselves verbally? So that's why I have that section there for us. And now that we understand and know how to deliver our or express ourselves verbally, then we can use the constructive and use those skills to debate. Then we have the rebuttal. So we solidify and reaffirm the team's position and explain why the team or the individuals, depending on the format, why we should win. So the constructive, think about Bob the Builder, right? So I like to say Bob the Builder, Wrecking Ball. I came up with that one summer and I didn't let it go. But it makes sense because when we think about the constructive, we're building our arguments, building our case, building our claims, and using our research to strengthen our argument. And then the other team's job is to wreck it and go, boom, here are the holes in the argument. And then you're rebuilding the argument, right? So if you think of building building wrecking ball, you start to see the ebb and flow of that debate environment. So when we have our constructive and our outline, we have our outlines, it's our format similar to a public speaking project like the policy speech. But now instead of having this hypothetical opposition that we're answering to within our presentation, we actually have our opposing team that can directly answer and comment to what you just said. So I love the speech dynamic just because we have that impromptu delivery style that's incorporated in there, and it makes it a little bit fun. It can be a little bit nerve-wracking, but no worries. It's an academic environment, respectful environment, and we're exercising that critical thinking skills, going back and forth. And I love to see, and I love to see how you formulate your ideas in that context as well. So I love this class. Um, so again, there will be a back and forth in that speech dynamic. So whether it be teams, and I always have the caveat depending on the semester, the size of the class, and the modality. Sometimes it's one-on-one, sometimes it's two-on-two, and sometimes it's three-on-three. Okay, so depending on when you see this, let me know if you have any questions. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the positions. Okay. So, like I said before, in general, I have teams of three. So we have the first set of speeches, second set of speeches, and third set of speeches. But if you're one-on-one, then you're all those things. In that particular context, you have the first, second, and third rounds, or first and second round. If you're two-on-two, then usually I have the first speaker do the first constructive speeches, and then the second person would do the rebuttal, excuse me, the constructive and rebuttals, and a brief closing. So it just depends on how I met you guys up. But let's talk about the speeches. So if we are in the traditional first, second, and third set of speeches, they have different roles for each position, right? So the first affirmative and first negative constructive speeches, they are the builders. That is they are the extemporaneous speakers. So thinking back to a public speaking course, that's when you have a set speech and you deliver it. So if you're really good at that, the first position might be for you. So you are establishing the argument, you are leading with the strongest arguments and setting the stage. Now, this is when it gets really fun. So, for the second set of speeches, because it's a back and forth, you have the first affirmative speaker, they talk, and then first negative speaker, they talk. So, by the time we get to the second speaker, we would have heard both sides, right? So, why we say it's the affirmative, constructive, and rebuttal, you rebuild the argument because remember, building, knockdown, building, knockdown. So we're in that knockdown mode, especially for that second affirmative constructive and rebuttal. So now we're rebuilding the case for the affirmative. But when we go back to the negative, they're knocking down that affirmative constructive and rebuilding their own arguments. Now, like I said before, if it's 2-on-2, then for that final set of speeches, it's that rebuttal and closing, those final arguments and closing out the speech. So that might be that one person that does that. Or if it's 3-on-3, then we have a slightly longer slightly longer third set of speeches, but we have the rebuttal, that last response to the second set of speeches, and closing out your team's main arguments. If you have any questions of what this looks like for your particular class, whether it be hybrid or online, please let me know. I have to speak in generalities because this might be used in multiple classes. So just let me know if you have any questions, okay? All right. Okay, so you have your first affirmative constructive. So let's go ahead and take a deeper dive into each role. We established the affirmatives advocacy of the resolution. Remember that resolution is the topic at hand, okay? So it's the topic that will be on top, like, hey, here's what we're arguing for or against. We are talking about if there's a problem that could be solved, the significance, so to what degree is the problem affecting a certain population? What are the harms or advantages of of the problem and the argument? The status quo isn't going to solve the problem without change, so that is the inherency. So without change, we have to advocate for the change to happen. So here's our specific proposal. That is the plan. So that'll be written throughout the outline. And our plan will solve the problem. So that is solvency. So those are some of the terms: significance, harm, advantage, inherency, plan, and solvency. So what are some techniques you can use for the first negative constructive? Remember, the first affirmative speaker is always first, right? So there's an ebb and a flow to it. The first affirmative speaker is always first. So they set the tone. So they have the ability to, hey, here's my argument. But as the first negative, there's certain burdens and responsibilities you have to have as well because you don't know exactly what they're going to say, but now we're in kind of responsible. So you're building your team's argument, but you're in like responsible a little bit too. Not as much as the second speaker or during the rebuttal stage, but you're building that argument. So you don't have that advantage of going first. That's what I'm trying to say. So you're attacking the affirmative and laying out additional issues for the negative. So just what are your topics, what are your claims, what are your supports? Makes the arguments against specifics in the affirmative case. So these are case arguments. So what are some arguments that are not sound, not stable? What are the disadvantages? Or if the plan is adopted, bad things will happen. So what are some of the disadvantages of the affirmative plan? What are some of the critiques? So the fundamental assumption that the reasoning or the plan that the affirmative case has is incorrect or flawed. So when we're thinking about how to build or how to establish our arguments, you can use these types of techniques to think about what they're going to say. So just as a side note, when we're developing our speeches, we have to anticipate what the other person's going to say. We're not going to know exactly what they're going to say until we're in it. So that's why we're like, okay, think about the case arguments, think about the plan, think about the disadvantages. That's what's going on. All right, so we also argue that the plan is not representative of the topic, topicality. Or you can argue there's an alternative to the plan that would be better. All right, so next, it's about the way. Next is, excuse me, next is the second affirmative constructive rebuttal. So remember, we're building, knocking down, building, knocking down. So by the time we get to this part of the speech, the second speaker, or for the second half of the presentation, the negative presented their arguments and excuse me, and now it's our job to rebuild the affirmative. So you can defend the affirmative positions, attack the negative positions now that we know what they are at this point. This is the last chance to introduce new issues for the affirmative for the last speaker or the last leg of the debate. You can't do that. So we argue that the disadvantages are reasons to vote affirmative. We argue that the counter plan or critique of the affirmative plan can coexist. And we answer all those negative issues and defends the affirmative positions. Then there we go. Now that we've heard from two sets of affirmative arguments and one set of negative arguments, it's the second negative speaker, or in that case, if there's one speaker, that second negative section to rebuild the negative argument for one last time. So we attack the affirmative positions, defend the negative positions. So if there's issues that weren't covered in the previous two speakers or sections of the speech, depending on how many speakers you have, then you can go ahead and introduce those then, and then attack the affirmative positions, defend the negative positions, as division of labor. So let me just go back and talk about what division of labor is. So say, for instance, you have 6 issues or arguments you want to put on the table, right? The first affirmative or first negative speaker can only do so much. So for example, you only have so much time to present issues. So you have the opportunity to let the first affirmative speaker say all that's going to be said of the arguments of the speeches, and then when we do the rebuttals and the second constructions, let them use those same arguments, or the first speakers say the most strongest arguments and save additional arguments for later on. So that's why we're talking about division of labor. Like, hey, are we going to lay all the arguments on the table with the first set of constructive speeches, or we're going to present some of the arguments and then save some for later? Okay. All right, so then we have the closing. So if there are 3 speakers in this context, then that would be like the last speech. If there are 2, then the person who's doing the rebuttals will also close out briefly. If we're doing one-on-one or online one-on-one, this will be an all-in-one type of section. So for example, you'll have the introduction, body section with those rebuttals, and closing. So for example, we select those winning issues. So the strongest issues we are reaffirming. We are not necessarily putting any new information out there, but it's almost like that recap. Similar to what we do for the policy speech, where we have that recap, recapping our arguments, and we are providing a closing. Think about the closing arguments in a courtroom. They don't necessarily bring out new evidence or anything like that. They summarize what went on in the trial and then have that last plea to the jury. Then the negative rebuttal or the closing section does the same thing. It's the last leg of the debate. What are some of your points? and your closing remarks. All right. So on this last leg of our lecture, we're going to dive into different techniques or issues to help build up those arguments in a debate. So I mentioned significance and harms before, and it deals with the importance of the problem. So for example, when we're thinking about an issue or claim with a debate, who is being harmed, and this is for our research, to what degree or what percentage of the population is being harmed by those issues. Then we have inherency. So what are some flaws, or excuse me, what are some, excuse me, what are some inherent conditions, whether it be in the law or whether it be in policy, that allows these harms to exist? So how has our present system or status quo failed? So for example, if I'm talking about higher cost of living in Southern California, one of the main culprits is higher cost of living, so that affects housing costs. That excuse me, that impacts higher cost, higher labor cost, higher cost of operating business, more regulation, which can contribute to higher cost, higher demand in people wanting to live in Southern California, lack of leadership as far as affordable housing. So there are a lot of things in the system that allows the high cost of housing to persist in Southern California. Okay, that's over here. Okay, so here is the plan. So for example, during a planned argument, the affirmative advocates for a specific course of action for solving the problem. So you might focus on the harms and see like, hey, here's what's wrong, but here is our plan to solve it. And this obviously we will explain why the plan will cure the harm. So for example, if I'm talking about housing accessibility in Southern California, I might propose accessory dwelling units or ADUs to help solve the issue. So it might not solve the entire problem, but hey, having affordable housing in addition to having rental income for those homeowners to give them more incentive to build these ADUs might be a way to help solve the problem. Then we have disadvantages. So for example, what could happen if the plan were adopted? We have unforeseen consequences to our solutions. We might need to say, hey, even though here are some of the disadvantages of our plan, here's why taking this sort of course of action is still better. Then we have critiques. So any proposal based on a number of interrelated assumptions, the negative can expose an incorrect assumption or case that built on it falls. So, for example, just to run back a little bit, we are using the stock issues and refuting the resolution. So, for example, the disadvantages, even though the affirmative is going to talk about the advantages, one of the ways to counter that is say, hey, well, these are the disadvantages, so just correct myself there. The negative will focus on, hey, even though these might be really good ideas, the disadvantages outweigh the advantages if we implement the plan. And then the critiques will be, hey, what are some assumptions? Like, what will be some of the assumptions of the affirmative that they're making that the plan will succeed? But we're saying, hey, that might not be the case. And you can make that argument why that'll fail. But then we have a current plan. So in a debate, you can't just say you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. What is your alternative solution? So then we have the counter plan that the negative can talk about and implement. Excuse me. Hey, here is a better idea, but it must be a reasonable substitute for the affirmative plan. So if building ADUs isn't a good plan, then the negative can say, hey, here's what is. So instead of building ADUs, build condos, for example. So here are some things to consider. So for the affirmative, when we're building our argument, we want to start with our thesis statement, a central idea. So for example, we want to give our ideas and a summary of our main pieces at the very beginning. Keep your contentions few and clear. So just make sure you have your major points to the case, your stock issues, but don't present too many subtopics because you have to defend them and explain them. You only have so much time for each section. Present your arguments in logical order. So that's what we practice with our policy speeches and other projects to outline and make sure we have a logical plan in place. You can use a problem solution format. You can talk about the problem, significance or impact, cause or inherency, solution, the plan, or workability, solvency. So if you want to follow that format, that's totally fine. Clearly articulate significance and impact. So you want to make sure like, hey, here's the plan and here's who's going to be affected or here's the results of this plan. Think about or have a well thought out, carefully written plan. That's why I have that outlined there for you so it can make sense. Problems are complex and so are speeches. So having that outline and having those steps in place can help you keep your thoughts clear, especially if you're in a context, especially in our hybrid in-person classes where we will be going back and forth in real time. Be comprehensive in discussing solvency. So solvency is an important issue and excuse me. And when we're thinking about it, yes, we're pointing out the issue, but if we're arguing for the resolution, we have to figure out, like, okay, how would our plan solve the problem? Not just saying, hey, here's a problem. That's not enough. All right. So the negative team or the negative side, what are some things to consider? So we're in attack mode. So we are against the resolution. So we're attacking the affirmative team claims of harm or minimize the impact of scenario. So that's one strategy to do that, or one strategy to anticipate what they're going to talk about and plan for your rebuttals. Use case terms, so capture what the team is saying and use it against them. So here's our impromptu type of strategy here. So say for instance, for those of us who will be in person or online synchronous, you will be able to write down some notes. So as you're talking, think about flipping that argument. What are some holes? What are some disadvantages? How do we indicate that your plan makes the problem worse? Knock out the stock issues. So because they have to win all those stock arguments, significance, inherency, and solvency, you can talk about, hey, you're missing one of those. Or you can say, hey, here's a weak argument and just kind of find that hole in the argument. Think about the most important points and attack them where they're presented. Number your arguments as well and centralize your argumentation. So, although the disadvantages of being the negative team is like, oh, we don't know what they're going to say, do research and think about the counter arguments, which we've done already in the policy speech. You'll be able to anticipate what they're going to say, and you'll have the opportunity in real time, depending on the context of our course, of course, to flip some of those arguments on their head. So, as you prepare for your debate, especially if there's a live debate, you and your teammates, if applicable, can play devil's advocate and be like, okay, here's what the founders will say. Here's how I'll counter, and all those things. Okay. All right. So some other ways to build a case: provide satisfactory definitions. So you can use definitions that are located in resolution to help frame your argument. Provide satisfactory criterion. So make sure that you use your facts, use your stats, talk about percentages, and talk about, okay, what does each value mean? What does each definition mean? Provide applications. So how can you apply these values or how can you apply these arguments in a real life context, right? So if it's accepted, what will happen? So if your plan is accepted, or if your plan is, or if your plan is implemented, rather, excuse me, how would this happen? Okay. All right. So Improve intrinsic. So you can talk about, hey, there's intrinsic values and elements between certain elements of the case. So, for example, the intrinsic value of having affordable housing in California is that more people are housed and they can help solve the homelessness crisis and people can feel safe. So, there is intrinsic value in that solution. The significance, advocates have to prove that the essentials of the case are significant. Through facts and stats is a really common way to do that, and especially to offset the negative ones. And make sure to put the case together, put the outlines together, so on and so forth. All right. So some last tips for the negative. You can attack certain parts of the affirmative side. You can attack the typicality and definition. So as a strategy for the affirmative to make sure to define our terms clearly, you can say, oh, that's not the definition, or we can counter with your own. Then there's certain criteria. So you can talk about how the criteria case that the affirmative case puts out are flawed or not good. You can also talk about and use your own stats to talk about significance. You can say, hey, minimize the significance of the situation, or just say, hey, what the cases that made, or excuse me, the case that the affirmative made is not significant enough to justify it's not significant enough to justify adopting resolution. And of course, that's on the affirmative side's burden to say, hey, this is a huge problem, and this is why. And you can say, hey, it's not enough because of A, B, and C. All right. Excuse me, can attack some of the essential elements of the affirmative case. That's not unique to the resolution's terms. You can talk about the application. So if they have a plan to say, hey, here's how our plan is going to work, here's how we're going to lay it out, and you can say, oh, no, that's not feasible because of A, B, and C. It could be budgetary limitations. It can be just not very logical when implementing it. You can talk about solvency. You can talk about how their goals straight up wouldn't solve the problem, or value objections. So you can talk about there will be unintended consequences from adoption of the affirmative case. All right. So it's a little bit of a longer online lecture, but go ahead and take a look, chop it down. Of course, I'll also provide these slides for you. But in addition to talking about debating as a whole, we're talking about, hey, how do we talk about advocating for with the affirmative case and against a position? Let me know if you have any questions. And depending on a format of the class or the content of the class at the time, some of us might be watching this as a hybrid class, so we'll have live in-person types of speeches and presentations, as well as an online synchronous course. We'll have those live in-person types of presentations. Now, if we are online asynchronous, I might format it a little bit differently as far as like, okay, we'll have one video from the one side and one video from the other side. So of course, let me know if you have any questions, especially depending on the format or modality of our course. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye.